We must tell you, plainly, that at 36 years old, Naomi Calloway stood on the wooden steps of the Cochise County Courthouse with everything she owned pressed into 2 carpet bags and $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. She had been cast out of her own home by Silas Calloway, her late husband's older brother, who had waved a yellowed promissory note under the county judge's nose and declared the Calloway ranch his by right of debt, leaving his brother's widow with nothing but her name and her grief. It was the autumn of 1887 in the Arizona Territory, the wind already carrying the first bite of winter down from the Chiricahuas, and Naomi had $11, a dead husband, and no roof to call her own. So when the auctioneer's gavel came down that afternoon on 80 forgotten acres of red rock the townsfolk called Widow's Mesa, sold for $6.40 because not one other soul in Sable Wells believed anything but rattlesnakes and regret could live up there, Naomi Calloway raised her hand and bought it. Everyone said it was a foolish, desperate thing for a woman with nothing to do. They did not know that sealed inside that dry, forsaken Mesa was a secret that would not only save her life, but would restore an entire family who had spent 20 years waiting, with unbroken faith, for someone to come home. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Calloway. If you are watching this from a place the world has written off as empty, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Naomi had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised outside of Prescott by her grandmother, Ruth Anders, a sharp-eyed widow who made her living reading the desert the way other women read scripture, and who had taught young Naomi that the difference between a wasteland and a garden was very often nothing but a person willing to look twice. Ruth had lost her own husband to a mining accident when Naomi was still small, and rather than fold into sorrow, she had turned herself into the most trusted herbalist and midwife in 3 counties, walking the dry washes and rocky slopes with a canvas satchel, teaching her granddaughter the names of every plant that could heal a fever, stop a bleeding wound, or coax water from stone-hard ground. "Nobody plants a garden in good soil, child," Ruth used to say, kneeling in some crack of shale where a stubborn cluster of paintbrush had pushed through. "Any fool can do that. The trick is knowing what still wants to live in the places everybody else has given up on." Naomi carried that lesson through her girlhood like a second heartbeat, learning to track water by the tilt of the land and the particular green of certain grasses, to read cloud shadows and animal trails, to trust her own eyes over the easy verdict of other people. She met Thomas Calloway at 19, at a barn dance in Sable Wells, and she loved him for the same quiet stubbornness her grandmother had modeled. He was a rancher's son who believed in fairness even when it cost him, who once rode 2 days to return a stray calf to a Mexican family the rest of the valley refused to deal with, simply because it was theirs. They married within the year, and for a decade they built a modest cattle operation together on land his father had left him, land that bordered, though neither of them thought much of it at the time, the base of that same forbidding Mesa the town would later mock her for buying. Ruth Anders died the winter Naomi turned 26, leaving her granddaughter a satchel of dried herbs, a notebook of remedies, and the unshakable conviction that value hides where pride refuses to search. Thomas and Naomi never had children of their own, a private sorrow they carried quietly between them. But they had each other, and they had a strange, tender family made of hired hands and neighbors who trusted Thomas's fairness and Naomi's steady hands whenever illness or birth or hardship came calling. Then came the winter of 1885, when a fever swept the valley. The same fever, some said, that Ruth Anders had spent her whole life learning to fight, and Thomas caught it tending a sick neighbor's herd instead of his own. Naomi nursed him for 11 days with every remedy her grandmother had taught her, boiling willow bark and feverfew, sitting up through nights, so cold her breath fogged the lamplight, and still it was not enough. He died in the spring, and something in Naomi went hollow and careful, the way a burned hand learns caution. What she did not yet know was that Thomas's older brother Silas, a man who had always resented that their father's best acreage went to the younger, gentler son, had been quietly buying up debts against the ranch for over a year, waiting for exactly this kind of opening. It was the values her grandmother gave her: patience, clear sight, the refusal to accept the easy verdict, that would carry Naomi through what came next. Though on the day she buried her husband, she could not have imagined how far down she still had to fall before those values would matter again. Grief has a way of making a woman slow to notice danger, and Silas Calloway understood that better than anyone. Within 3 months of Thomas's death, he arrived at the ranch house with a lawyer from Tucson and a promissory note bearing what he swore was Thomas's signature, claiming his brother had borrowed $800 against the property 2 years prior to cover a bad cattle season, a debt Naomi had never once heard mentioned in 10 years of marriage. She fought it as hard as a grieving widow with no money for her own attorney could fight anything, riding into Sable Wells to beg Judge Emmett Hollis for time, insisting the signature looked wrong to her, that Thomas would have told her, that something about the whole arrangement smelled of old family bitterness rather than honest debt. But without funds to hire a handwriting expert, without a single document of her own to counter Silas's paperwork, Naomi had only her word against a note that looked convincing enough on paper, and paper, in that country in that year, carried more weight than a widow's memory. Judge Hollis, a careful and not unkind man, told her plainly that his hands were bound by what evidence existed, and what existed favored Silas. She lost the house first, then the herd, then the modest savings she and Thomas had kept in the Sable Wells Bank, most of which went toward legal fees that accomplished nothing but delaying the inevitable. Neighbors who had once brought her casseroles during Thomas's illness now looked away when she passed on the street. Not from cruelty, but from the particular discomfort decent people feel around misfortune they cannot fix and do not fully understand. Silas took over the ranch that had been his brother's pride, and within a season he had sold off half the good grazing land to Wallace Pruitt, a cattle baron from the eastern part of the territory who had been trying to buy his way into Sable Wells for years, using the profit to settle debts of his own that had nothing to do with any promissory note. Naomi moved first into a rented room above the mercantile, then, when even that grew too dear, into the back corner of the church hall, doing mending and midwifery for whatever coins or eggs or firewood people could spare. She kept her grandmother's satchel of herbs close through all of it, the one possession Silas's lawyer had no claim on, and some nights it was the only thing that reminded her she had once been more than a woman other people pitied. By the time autumn came again, Naomi Calloway had exactly $11 to her name, sewn carefully into her hem where no thief or ill wind could take it, and a growing, desperate understanding that she would need land of her own, however poor, before winter closed the last doors available to a woman alone. It was in that state of mind, proud enough to refuse charity, poor enough to refuse nothing else, that she heard the county was auctioning off tax-forfeited parcels on the courthouse steps, including 80 acres of what everyone in Sable Wells simply called Widow's Mesa, a flat-topped rise of red rock at the valley's northern edge that had passed through 3 owners in 40 years, none of whom had ever managed to graze a single cow on it or find a drop of water worth the digging. Silas laughed when he heard she meant a bid. Wallace Pruitt, standing beside him that day with the easy confidence of a man who owned half the valley already, called it charity work for the county, buying land nobody wanted from a woman nobody wanted either. Naomi said nothing to either of them. She simply raised her hand when the auctioneer called the parcel, and for $6.40, Widow's Mesa became hers. She rode up to see it the following morning, alone, on a borrowed mule, because there was no one left to ask to come with her, and because she had learned, in the hard years since Thomas's death, that she preferred her own company to pity. The mesa rose out of the valley floor like something the earth had forgotten to finish, its sides too steep and rocky for cattle, its top, from below, appearing to be nothing but scrub and sun-bleached stone. It took her the better part of 2 hours to find a trail up the eastern face, an old switchback path so overgrown with creosote and cat's claw that she suspected no one had climbed it in a generation, and by the time she reached the top, her hands were scratched and her water flask nearly empty. What she found there was, at first glance, exactly what everyone had promised her: a flat, wind-scoured plain of hardpan and thin grass, dotted with the pale bones of a long-dead juniper and very little else. She sat down on a boulder and allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, to weep Not for the land, which she had never expected much from, but for the $11 now gone and the winter still coming. It was while wiping her eyes that she noticed the ravens. 3 of them circled low over a section of the mesa's northern edge, near where the flat ground seemed to fold and disappear into a shadow she had taken, from a distance, for simply another outcrop of rock. Ruth Anders's voice rose up in her memory, as clear as if the old woman stood beside her. Birds do not circle empty ground, child. They circle water and shade and something worth the trouble. Naomi rose, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked toward that shadowed fold. And what she found there stopped her breath entirely. The mesa's northern rim did not end in a cliff as it appeared to from below, but folded inward on itself, hiding a narrow, hidden defile scarcely wider than a wagon, its walls dropping away into a canyon invisible from any angle in the valley or even from most of the mesa top itself. Down inside that hidden crack in the earth, she could see green, actual green, deep and unmistakable, the color of cottonwoods and cultivated rose, utterly impossible on a mesa the whole county had called barren for 40 years. Her heart hammering, she found a narrow game trail switchbacking down into the shadow, and she followed it, telling herself the whole way down that she was imagining things, that grief and desperation could make a woman see gardens in mirages. She was 3/4 of the way down the trail, close enough now to hear the unmistakable trickle of running water, when she saw the first sign that she was not merely imagining a garden. She saw smoke. The smoke rose thin and gray from a stone chimney tucked against the far canyon wall, curling up past a stand of old cottonwoods whose roots she now understood must reach down to some spring the whole valley had never known existed. And Naomi stood frozen on that narrow trail with her heart pounding harder than it had since the day she buried Thomas, because a chimney meant a house, and a house meant people, and people meant that widow's Mesa, for all its reputation as the emptiest ground in Cochise County, held a secret nobody below had ever suspected. She almost turned back. It occurred to her, standing there with the wind moving through cottonwood leaves far greener than anything she'd seen in a year, that she might be trespassing on some hermit's private ground, or worse, stumbling into danger with no one in the world aware of where she'd gone. But it was her grandmother's old courage that pushed her forward instead. That same conviction that the things worth finding were never found by people who turned back at the first sign of the unknown. And so she continued down the trail until it opened into a narrow box canyon, perhaps 2 acres wide, walled on 3 sides by sheer red rock, fed by a spring that bubbled clear and cold from a crevice near its head and wound its way through neat, terraced rows of corn and beans and squash, an orchard of a dozen aging peach trees, and a low adobe house with a stone chimney, goats grazing near a brush corral, and, standing in the dooryard with a hoe raised half in defense and half in astonishment, an elderly woman with silver-black hair and eyes the color of the canyon's own shadowed rock, staring at Naomi as though she were seeing a ghost, or perhaps, at long last, an answer to a prayer. The old woman's name, Naomi would learn before the sun set that day, was Esperanza Vega, and the story she told, haltingly at first, and then in a flood once she understood Naomi meant no harm, unspooled a secret that had been sealed inside that hidden canyon for 20 years. Esperanza's husband, Rafael Vega, had held the original land grant to this mesa and the valley floor below it, a grant given to his grandfather by the Mexican government decades before the territory ever belonged to the United States, long before any Callaway or Pruitt had ever set eyes on the country. When the Americans came, and the paperwork of ownership grew tangled and contested, when a drought year brought raiding parties down from the north and false rumors of worse violence still to come, Raphael had done what he believed any careful father would do. He had moved his wife and children up into this hidden canyon his own grandfather had shown him as a boy, a natural fortress with its own water and good soil, meaning to wait out the danger for a season, no more. He had gone back down to Sable Wells that same autumn to secure supplies, to speak with the American Land Office about protecting his family's claim, and to send word to relatives in Sonora that all was well. He had never returned. Esperanza had waited that first winter, believing some delay had kept him, some difficulty with the land office, or the weather on the trail. She had waited a second winter, believing perhaps he feared bringing violence up the Mesa Trail behind him and was protecting them from a distance. By the third year, with 2 young children to feed and a canyon that, whatever else it lacked for nothing in water or soil, she had simply stayed, telling her children that their father would return when it was safe, and telling herself the same thing long after any reasonable woman might have stopped believing it. Her children, Teodora and Andres, had grown to adulthood in that hidden canyon, knowing almost nothing of the world beyond the mesa's rim except what their mother remembered and what little Raphael had taught them before he left. Teodora, now, had children of her own, born and raised entirely within those red rock walls, who had never once seen the town whose lights they could sometimes glimpse, distant and small, from the mesa's edge at night. For 20 years, this family had lived in complete isolation, growing their own food, weaving their own cloth, treating their own illnesses with remedies not unlike the ones Naomi's own grandmother had taught her, all of it sustained by one unbroken article of faith, that Rafael Vega had promised a return, and Esperanza would not abandon the place where he expected to find them. Naomi sat with Esperanza long into that first evening, sharing the last of her water and a little dried meat from her saddlebag, listening as the old woman's voice grew thick with a grief that had never been permitted to finish grieving, because grief requires an ending, and Esperanza had spent 2 decades refusing to give hers one. It was there, in the gathering dusk, with smoke rising from the chimney and Teodora's children peering shyly from the doorway at the first stranger they had ever seen who was not their own kin, that Esperanza brought out the one object she had kept hidden even from her own children. A small tin box, rusted at the corners, containing Raphael's own hand-copied grant papers, a rosary that had belonged to his mother, and a single letter, unfinished, that he had begun writing to Esperanza the night before he set out for Sable Wells, a letter full of ordinary tenderness and practical plans for their return to open land once the trouble passed. A letter that ended mid-sentence, as though he had simply set down his pen to sleep and never picked it back up. Naomi understood, holding that unfinished letter by lamplight, that she was looking at the true secret sealed inside Widow's Mesa. Not treasure, not gold, but an entire family suspended for 20 years in the single unbearable moment of waiting for someone who was never coming back, and that the task now fallen to her, whether she wanted it or not, was to find out what had truly happened to Rafael Vega, and to help this family finally come home to the world. She began the next morning by returning to Sable Wells and calling on the one man in town who had never joined in the general scorn of her Mesa purchase, a young law clerk named Delwyn Whitcomb, who worked for the county recorder and had always struck Naomi as more interested in old records than in old gossip. She told him only that she believed there might be a prior claim on her Mesa property worth researching, careful not to reveal the Vega family's presence until she understood what danger that revelation might bring them. Del, delighted by any excuse to dig through the recorder's dusty archive of Mexican-era land grants, spent 3 days pulling records and returned to her with confirmation that startled even Naomi. The original Vega grant, filed decades before American territorial government existed, had never been formally extinguished, merely overlooked and buried beneath newer American surveys that assumed the land was vacant. Her own tax deed, purchased for $6.40, was legally sound as far as the county's forfeiture process went, but it sat atop a far older, far stronger claim that had simply never been contested because no one below had ever known the Mesa was inhabited at all. Dell also found, buried in a decade-old file of unclaimed county correspondence, a brief notation. A man matching Rafael Vega's description had died of a rattlesnake bite on the trail below the Mesa in the autumn of 1867, buried by strangers who never learned his name, his few possessions turned over to the county, and eventually sold at auction for lack of any known kin. Naomi rode home that night with the answer Esperanza had waited 20 years to receive, and she did not know, yet, whether it was a mercy or a fresh wound to finally deliver it. Word travels fast in a small territory, and it did not take Wallace Pruitt long to hear rumors that the woman he'd mocked at auction had found something worth having on that Mesa. He rode up to the canyon rim himself within the month, guided by a hired tracker who had followed Naomi's trail, and stood at the edge of that hidden defile, staring down at running water and green fields in a country he had spent 3 years trying to buy up precisely, because water was the one thing he could never find enough of. Pruitt did not need to see the Vega family to understand what he was looking at. He understood immediately that whoever controlled that spring controlled the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction, and he returned to Sable Wells determined to have it, joining forces with Silas Calloway, who still smarted at the sight of his brother's widow, succeeding at anything at all. Together, the two men filed a formal challenge to Naomi's tax deed before Judge Hollis, arguing that the parcel's forfeiture sale had been improperly conducted since the county had not accounted for occupants on the land, and that ownership should therefore revert to the county for resale. A resale, everyone understood, that Pruitt's money would win handily the second time around. The hearing that followed drew half the town into the small Sable Wells courthouse, curious to see what had become of the widow they'd all quietly written off a year earlier. Silas took the stand first, painting Naomi as a woman who had stumbled on his squatters and now sought to profit from their misfortune, conveniently omitting his own history of taking advantage of a grieving widow through paperwork of his own. Pruitt's lawyer argued, with polished confidence, that no forfeiture sale could convey clean title over occupied land, that the Vega family, whoever they were, had no standing to remain, and that the county's interest, and by extension Pruitt's ready capital, should prevail. Naomi sat through it with her grandmother's satchel in her lap, and when Judge Hollis finally called on her to respond, she rose and told the truth in its entirety, about Esperanza Vega and her children and grandchildren, about the original Mexican land Grant Del Whitcomb had uncovered in the county's own buried records, about Rafael Vega's death on the very trail below the Mesa 2 decades before, verified by the county's own forgotten correspondence, and about a family that had waited 20 years for a return that would never come, sustained the entire time not by charity or trespass, but by their own hands and their own rightful land. She placed on the judge's bench, as she spoke, the small tin box Esperanza had entrusted to her, the hand-copied grant papers, and the unfinished letter inside it, evidence that the Vega claim predated every American deed in the room by decades and had simply been erased by neglect rather than any lawful process. Judge Hollis, who had once been forced by insufficient evidence to rule against Naomi in her own hour of need, examined those papers with visible and growing gravity, cross-referencing them against Del Whitcomb's county records while the courtroom held its breath. He ruled, in the end, that the original Vega grant remained valid and controlling, that Naomi's tax deed could stand alongside it only insofar as she and the Vega family reached their own accord, and that neither Wallace Pruitt nor Silas Calloway held any legitimate claim whatsoever to land that had never truly been vacant, nor forfeited, nor theirs to contest in the first place. It was, in its quiet way, exactly the kind of justice the law had failed to offer Naomi a year before, arriving now not by luck, but because this time the evidence, patient, buried, and true, finally stood on her side. What Naomi did next surprised the entire valley more than anything that had come before. She did not claim the Mesa's spring for herself, nor sell her interest to the highest bidder as Pruitt had assumed any sensible person would. She rode back up that hidden trail and sat with Esperanza Vega beneath the peach trees and told her everything Del Whitcomb had found, including the small, hard truth of Raphael's death on the trail so long ago. Watching as 20 years of suspended grief finally broke and resolved itself into something Esperanza could at last set down. Together, the two women decided that the Vega family's water, which had sustained one hidden household for 2 decades, could sustain a great deal more than that if it were shared rather than hoarded, and Naomi proposed what became, that following spring, a modest but thriving cooperative, a shared cattle and orchard operation drawing on the Mesa Spring, jointly owned by the Vega family and by Naomi herself, employing several of the same neighbors who had once looked away from her on the street, and supplying water, at fair and steady terms, to smaller ranchers in the valley who had never been able to compete with men like Wallace Pruitt. Silas Calloway, exposed before the whole county as a man who had built his fortune on a forged note and a hidden family's stolen obscurity, found his standing in Sable Wells quietly and thoroughly ruined, his creditors calling in debts of their own once his reputation no longer shielded him, while Pruitt, having overreached publicly and lost, retreated from the Valley's affairs for good. No dramatic punishment fell on either man. The Valley simply, gradually, stopped extending them the credit of trust, which proved, in the end, to be its own form of justice. It is worth remembering, as this story closes, that everything which unfolded afterward began with a woman standing on a courthouse step with $11 sewn into her hem, buying 80 acres of ground that not a single other soul in Cochise County believed could hold anything but rattlesnakes and regret. Naomi Calloway had learned, from a grandmother who read water in dry ground and value in forgotten places, that the world's easy verdicts are very often wrong, and that patience paired with clear sight can uncover what pride and haste will always miss. She had lost a husband, a home, and a herd to a man who mistook paperwork for truth, and she had found, on the very land everyone told her was worthless, a family who had spent 20 years proving that life persists in the places the world stops looking. What Naomi restored on that mesa was never simply a spring or a canyon or a legal claim. It was a family's right to finally stop waiting and start living again in the open, and a valley's chance to learn that the woman it had pitted and dismissed carried inside her, all along, exactly the kind of quiet, stubborn faith a place like Sable Wells needed in order to heal. Settle back, if you will, into that image of Naomi Calloway on the courthouse steps, and understand now what none of them could have known that day, that the emptiest ground in the county held the fullest kind of life, and that it took a woman with nothing left to lose to finally see it. We thank you, truly, for spending this quiet hour with Naomi Calloway and the family who waited so faithfully atop that forgotten mesa. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked places and overlooked people so often hold more than the world assumes. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that everybody else had already written off. Your stories are the reason we keep telling these ones. Until next time, stay close.